This meeting is being recorded.
Welcome to this mental coronavirus Q&A session, and thank you for joining us today. The contents of this webinar do not purport to provide any financial, investment or professional advice, and nothing in the content of this webinar shall be deemed to constitute the provision of financial, investment or other professional advice in any way. This week, following the announcement about the easing of restrictions in England, we're going to be discussing and taking questions on the topic of returning to work safely. I'm Helen Easton, and I'm joined today by two of Mentor specialists. I've got Nick Sorrett, representing Employment Law, and Pete Nichols to help us along with the health and safety questions. All participants are on listen-only mode, and there is an option to ask questions as we go along via the Q&A button within the Zoom app. We do try to answer as many questions as we can during these weekly sessions, and we use all of your questions to update our FAQs within the coronavirus section of our Mentor Live system. Nick, I'm going to come to you first and ask you which sectors can now actually return to work?
Yes, thanks, Helen. Hello, everybody. Thanks for taking the time and trouble to join us today. Following Boris Johnson's announcement on Sunday, the government's now published its plan to ease the country out of lockdown. It's called Our Plan to Rebuild, and I'll thoroughly recommend, if you haven't already done so and you're in business, you have a look at this, because it's a roadmap to the future relaxations of lockdown. Now, actually, for all the noise, there's been very little change in terms of businesses that are allowed to reopen. And what they're doing from the 13th of May is concentrating heavily on the sectors that weren't ordered to close in the first place, but which actually chose to do. So good examples there are manufacturing and construction sites. The government's also concentrating on food supply. Well, that's all happening, and logistics. Well, again, I think that that's already been happening. Looking forward, they've announced another key date, another couple of key dates. 1st of June, they're subject to everything going well, expecting that some non-essential retail will reopen. And from the 4th of July, that's really the earliest possible date for hospitality, leisure and personal services businesses such as hairdressers to reopen. But again, that's subject to everything going well.
Thanks, Nick. And has there been any relaxation in the businesses that have been ordered to close? I mean, I know you just mentioned about others.
Yeah, absolutely. There are still a lot of businesses that are ordered to close by law, and the legislation sets those out. All that they have done is released a couple of businesses from that, garden centres being a significant one, and something they call sports courts, which I think they mean outdoor tennis courts and things like golf clubs. It also seems that estate agents may reopen as part of the government's plan to restart the housing market. I say it seems because they're not listed as premises that may open, but it is now lawful to travel to an estate agent to do business. So presumably the estate agents may open for that business to be undertaken. But other than that, there are no changes, particularly on the high street.
Okay, thanks for that. So something that everybody's been trying to do is trying to keep to work from home where possible, because I know that was part of the legislation. So Pete, from a health and safety perspective, should I keep my staff working from home?
Yes, there's not really been any change there again, to be honest. And what the government is saying as part of their Our Plan to Rebuild that Nick mentioned is that for the foreseeable future, people should continue to work from home rather than their normal physical workplace if they possibly can. So obviously, by doing that, that's going to cut down on a number of social interactions. It's going to take the pressure off public transport. So that's always going to be the best option at the moment, is to try and work from home if at all possible.
Helen, I think you're on mute.
I've done this too often now. So talk to us now a bit more about what the new guidance is for the UK government, you know, and what they've produced on returning to work, would you?
Yes, the government have clearly been very busy producing this new guidance. So there's 8 new sector guidance documents which you can download from the UK government website. Possibly a 9th one as well, I think might have been added, but these are sort of covering various sectors. So for example, there's one that covers agriculture and construction and outdoor type work. You know, there's another one for sort of for taxis and public hire vehicles. There's one for manufacturing and warehousing and that type of sector. So these are very good guides, actually very well written. They've been produced in conjunction with the HSE, Public Health England, the regional assemblies, the unions as well. So there's a lot of inputs gone into these guides. They're around about 30 pages long. They're very practical. And what the government is saying here is that it's up to businesses to sort of translate the information into there that's in there, the sort of practical risk controls to allow them to get back to work and work safely. That's the idea. There are a couple of things in there as well, just to mention really, is that the guidance, what it says is it does not supersede any legal obligations relating to health and safety, employment law or equalities as well. So this is new guidance, but it's not overwriting existing health and safety law, which is an interesting point to make. And also, when you download that information, and we strongly recommend you do that, you might need to download 1 or 2 of the guides if you've got business operations that cut across more than one of them. So for instance, if you've got transport and warehousing, you know, you might need to look at 2 guides there. Also, interestingly, there is a notice or a poster that they call it, that says we've complied with the government's guidance on Covid-19. So there's an expectation there that you print that 1-page notice out and you put it on display in your workplace as well. That's quite important. It shows that you've looked at the guidance and you've read it and you're following it. So yeah, that's an interesting one as well there.
Thanks, Pete. I'm going to go quite specific now. We had a question in earlier on about a hairdressing salon, and they were sort of saying that they'd heard they couldn't go back to work until July. Is it strictly speaking true?
Yes, I'm afraid it is. In the government's roadmap, they've set out their aspirational date of 4th of July for that sort of personal services business. Now, I think this is the sign of the real risk-based approach that the government's now taking up, and it's looking to, I'm afraid, the sectors where there's the sort of closest personal contact. Even though we all need a haircut, you know, it's a high-risk business because hairdressers come into contact with a lot of people every day. They themselves may begin the working day being perfectly healthy, but they may not end the working day being healthy. And in the meantime, they've contacted a lot of people. So I'm afraid that's the case. I don't know if you have any comments on that, Pete.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. I'm one of those people that doesn't need a haircut, thankfully. However, I think without doubt now is the time for hairdressers and other businesses that aren't able to open at the moment just to start getting their head around opening. So, I mean, you know, you can look at the government guidance that's been produced. You can look at your professional bodies, get information from trade bodies, that sort of thing, and just start thinking about how you're going to organise yourself to get back into work, and different shift patterns and separating workstations and things like that. Really, so there's plenty to think about just to hit the ground running, really, if you like.
I think we've had a question come through on the Q&A stream, and it was specifically around nurseries and how you would suggest that they practice social distancing amongst the staff there. Any top tips at all?
That, again, everything's going to be down to a risk assessment approach here. So the government are certainly advising that every business needs to have a COVID-19 risk assessment. And the starting point for that, well, you can download one. We've got an example COVID-19 risk assessment on Mental Live. So that's a good starting point. Again, it's all going to be around practical risk controls, around keeping staff distance from each other as much as possible, and the children as well. It's certainly not going to be easy with young children, but I think there's going to be an element here of staggered intakes, reducing the number of the sizes of classes, that type of thing, and just using as much of the outdoor space as possible to minimise these interactions. But I know it won't be easy. So making an early start on these practical considerations is going to be important.
Okay, so I'm glad you started talking about practical considerations. So the next question is, in a more general term, how would you suggest that businesses do actually start getting ready for work? What are the steps they need to take?
Well, again, going back to the guidance, download the guidance, read it carefully, talk to other people. Don't just use one source of information. Look at what other people are doing, what other businesses, what are your trade bodies and your professional bodies, sort of what are they advocating, and try and use all that information. What's going to be really important here is to involve staff at a really early stage. So it's getting staff input. You really need to get staff to buy into what you're planning to do. So, get their thoughts. They're the ones that actually do the job. They will come up with some great ideas, I'm sure. And just as you normally would involve them in the risk assessment process, this is going to be a really key area here. And actually, when you read the government guidance, the new government sector-specific guidance, there's a really big emphasis on consultation with staff. It's a really big factor here. And I think, people like the HSE and other bodies have recognised straight away that there's a real need to do this and to get staff on board and to make them feel comfortable with what you're going to do. So that really is key to all of this, I would say.
Thanks, Pete. I mean, you've mentioned on a number of occasions already now about risk assessments. But look, if my business is already following government advice, do I really need another risk assessment for COVID-19?
Yeah, the simple answer is yes, you do. Presumably your business has already got risk assessments. It should have. I would say that under health and safety legislation, if you employ less than 5 people, you don't actually have to write these risk assessments down. But any health and safety professional will tell you the same. You record your risk assessments nonetheless, because that's your evidence that you've actually got risk assessments in place. But governments have also, the UK government and the assemblies have been talking about the need for a risk assessment for quite a while now. And they've actually put it into writing, really, and they've emphasised it much more in this new sector guidance. So you will need a risk assessment, or you might choose just to build your new risk controls into your existing risk assessments. But either way, you'll need to have evidence that you've looked at these things. Interestingly, in the guidance, the government is also saying that they would expect larger businesses to actually publish details of what they're doing. So publish details of their COVID-19 risk assessments. And they have an expectation that if you employ 50 or more people, that they'd expect to see that on your website. That's really quite an interesting new development that's not been in health and safety sort of provisions before, if you like. So how well that's going to be enforced, we don't know, but certainly there's a big emphasis here on getting these risk assessments done. And they're, as I say, they just need to follow practical risk controls. Really, clients that I've spoken to in the last few weeks that have still been operating through the lockdown, that they've come up with these practical risks themselves. To be honest, because a lot of it is quite sensible stuff. So it's a lot of it won't be really too new.
Thanks, Pete. I'm going to ask you a question now about PPE, don't you? So come on, you're going to have to tell us all, what does the UK government actually expect businesses to do with regards to PPE? And please, can you include some guidance for us around face masks?
Right, okay. Yeah, I think in all honesty, people are getting quite hung up on PPE, not surprisingly, because the government really for a long time didn't talk about it and they left it out of their conversations and their daily briefings. But it has been cemented into their guidance now. So there's absolutely not a recommendation, but there's a requirement that that where a business already uses PPE for their normal sort of operations, they should be carrying on using that. So if they're using face masks because they're working in a dusty environment, or they're working with fumes, or they're wearing gloves because they're working with chemicals, nothing has changed there. You will still wear that PPE when you go back to work. And obviously it's going to be important for employers to source new stocks as quickly as possible, and to think about this early, because it's likely to be more expensive and it's likely to be more difficult to get. In terms of COVID-19, the government and their advisors are going at great pains to say that, look, no one should be wearing additional PPE such as masks and gloves and things like that as a protection against spreading COVID-19. Now, there will be some circumstances, obviously, like in a clinical setting, where people will be wearing PPE, on the front line, in nursing, that type of thing. But for average day-to-day businesses, they shouldn't be using PPE as a risk control around spreading coronavirus. And the reason for this is, as the government keeps saying, it's not effective. The effective measures are social distancing and good hand washing procedures. So this is going to be your primary control measures in your risk assessments. Regarding face coverings, yes, the government is suggesting that it would be helpful for people to wear face coverings when they go back to work, when they're in confined spaces, or in spaces where there are people sort of close around them, on public transport, that sort of thing. And they may want to wear them to work as well. But that's sort of up to them, really. It's not going to be one of your risk controls as a business, but I think you should support them if they want to wear it, because if it gives them the confidence to return to work, that's good. But obviously, you need to be mindful of hygiene requirements here as well. These things need to be sort of regularly washed. But certainly, face coverings can't be relied upon.
So you mentioned in your answer there about travelling to and from work, and we've already had quite a few questions come through on the stream about commuting and staff's anxiety about commuting and that sort of thing. So both from a health and safety and an employment law perspective, where do employers stand around the commute into work?
Well, I'll take that from an employment law stance. Changing, the government's recommending really that the commute be staggered to avoid public transport where possible. I mean, they're obviously, also recommending that people use their cars, which, of course, many people either don't have cars, don't have access to a car, or there's no parking, or and so on. So it's not realistic. So those people will be going in on public transport. And we've seen pictures in London of buses being full. And of course, the bus drivers are now instructed, I believe, well, you have to go past certain bus stops if it looks as if there's going to be too many people getting on. So it's going to be really difficult for people, because it's not really normal circumstances. You're asking people to come into work on different hours, and they may not be able to work those different hours. So it's very much one for individual consultation. I think it's unrealistic to expect people to do things that they're not comfortable with, and they really need to have some sort of a buy-in. So I'd strongly suggest that you do consult with staff about revised commuting arrangements if you want to do that. If they still refuse to come in because they're really frightened, again, you need to have that conversation. I don't know, Pete, from a health and safety point of view, do you have any view?
Yeah, from a health and safety point of view, I certainly want to avoid public transport if I possibly could. If I had to, if I was totally reliant on public transport and needed to go on public transport, then, the sort of thing I would be doing personally is I'd be washing my hands before I go on the bus or train, whatever it is. I'd be sitting in an area facing away from people, or sitting side by side part of the bus or the train where there's no one near me. I'd be wearing a face covering for the whole journey, not touching my face, not touching the mask. And then when I finished and I got off the public transport, I'd be washing my hands as soon as I could, or using hand gel. And that's really just following the government advice, to be honest. And that's really about as much as you can do from a health and safety perspective.
Thanks, Pete. And would you, if for example you've got car sharing, or you've got 2 delivery personnel in a lorry, would you be following those same guidelines?
Similar guidance again. Similar guidance, and again, there is information that the government provided on travelling with other people. So some of the practical measures you can take is minimising the time you're in the car or the vehicle with someone else. One of you could, or both of you could be wearing a face covering. You could be having the window wind down, or possibly if it's a bigger vehicle, you might have someone sat in the back seat rather than the front seat with you as well. So again, there are some things you can do to minimise those risks.
Thanks, Pete. Okay, so let's talk now about staff and their attitude to returning to work. So we've got lots of people who can't return to work because they've got school-aged children at home. Nick, what's the stance on that?
Yes, well, this is a difficulty. We know that nannies and childminders are now allowed to operate subject to social distancing rules. Clearly, that doesn't cover many people with children. And we know that the earliest date that some schools will go back is the 1st of June. And I believe initially it's really just primary year reception 1 and 6. And then with the expectation that all primary children will get some schooling by mid-June. But even then, that may well not be full-time attendance at school, because the schools are working with the unions. I think it's in the news today. It'll be reduced class sizes. It may be sort of part-time schooling arrangements. And of course, secondary-aged children are not looking to return to school until September. So childcare issues are going to continue to be a real issue. And of course, sending the children to their grandparents, even if they used to do it in the past, is still not advised. I'm afraid the Prime Minister did answer the question when he was asked it earlier this week, and basically said that employees should speak to their employer about it. Well, fine. So if as an employer, if the employer does speak to you about it, a few suggestions. I mean, firstly is work from home if at all possible. That you can give people some work from home if others are returning. Consider furlough for those people, because it is available for people with caring responsibilities. You might need to take some advice on that before you decide to do it. But I think that's a possibility. And another possibility, of course, is some unpaid time off under the time off for dependents legislation. But of course, that's not very satisfactory at all for the employee, because they may not be able to afford that. So those are a few suggestions there.
Thanks, Nick. You mentioned their dependence leave, so we have had a specific question around, look, if you've got staff demanding dependence leave, either because they've got children or they've got other caring responsibilities, and they have to stay at home, what are the employer's responsibilities, and do they actually have to pay them?
Yeah, there is something called time off for dependents. It's not really designed for long-term situations. It was designed for there being a family emergency, such as a child having to come home from school being ill, completely unplanned, and the parents allowed legally that time off, for as long as it takes to deal with that situation and put in place alternative care. So no longer than a few days. There isn't a right to be paid for it. I think legally speaking, it could be used, but as I say, it is unpaid. So that would work. It would retain the individual in employment, but of course they wouldn't be paid for it. So there is no other availability of sort of paid parental leave in the United Kingdom.
Okay, so let's move back into sort of getting back to work. I had a question about a business who would prefer their operation to be from the office, because although working from home is feasible, apparently it's not efficient. So is that business able to reopen the office and ask staff to come in and work?
Yeah, we've had a few questions along those sorts of lines, Helen. And I think it's really understandable that there's confusion about this, because Boris Johnson and the government are putting a return to work message. But as I said in answer to one of the earlier questions, there's still a whole list of premises that have been ordered to remain closed. And it remains the law that people shouldn't be away from their home unless it's for one of a number of legally permissible reasons. And one of those is to travel to work where it's not reasonably possible for them to work from home. That remains the law. So, if they've been able to work from home, albeit not to 100%, but to sort of 70% capacity or whatever, then it seems to me that it's still reasonably possible for them to return from home, and that they shouldn't be travelling to an office environment. Now, the government hasn't relaxed that legislation, and they could have done. So they added garden centres to the list of premises allowed to open, but they didn't make any other changes in this way. And of course, we do know that the reason behind this is to try and avoid overwhelming public transport in large urban centres where most of these sort of white-collar office jobs are. Clearly very, very difficult to say to any individual, can your work be, reasonably possibly be done from home? But I'm afraid, that's the law, and employers, they shouldn't be getting people back to work just because they would prefer them back in the office. That's not what they're supposed to be doing.
Okay, thanks for that. So we had another question come through about shift work. And we know that, in order to increase social distancing, some employers have chosen to spread working hours and spread it over maybe a couple of shifts. Can they do this? What is the panel's advice on this particular situation?
Yeah, I'll take that first time. I think employers are absolutely right to be considering changes to working times, extension of working hours to support social distancing. I think they've announced that construction sites can, remain open until 9 in the evening now as well. With exactly that aim in mind. So whether they're causing a nuisance or not is neither here nor there. So employers are absolutely right to be considering that. And also, of course, to help staff avoid the busiest public transport times. But of course, it brings difficulties of its own, because you may find you're asking staff to work when there isn't any public transport to get them to the workplace. You may be asking them to work when they simply can't, because their home arrangements don't allow them to do that. So the really important thing here, and we've said it before, is that you do this in consultation with your staff, because changing these times will work for some people, but will work less well for others and won't work at all for some others. And if you do it in consultation with your staff, so what you're planning, and see what their views are, then you're much more likely to get buy-in and to get it to happen. Of course, what you're looking for in the longer run is that you may be thinking, well, actually, my existing contracts of employment, say 9 to 5, and I'm asking people to work from, 6 till 12 or whatever. So you may be having to look at that as well in terms of making changes to terms and conditions, and you'd certainly need to do that in consultation with staff. So my advice here really is talk to your staff absolutely at the outset, see what you can make workable, and take professional advice if you encounter any difficulty. I don't think you should be imposing changes of hours on people. That's my view. Pete, your view?
Yeah, my view on this, Nick, thanks, is it's going to be something you'll need to obviously talk to staff at an early stage at again. There are a few sort of health and safety considerations, and you'll probably expect me to say you need a risk assessment, and I will. You'll need to risk assess as you do anything really in health and safety, because it's quite a big change really to the way that people work. A couple of things to be aware of really, apart from the risk assessment, is just to be aware of the working time regulations and sort of hours that people are working, and if you are getting staff to go to start doing sort of night work, then there's a requirement there in legislation for sort of medicals or health questionnaires, and to keep an eye on that type of thing as well, because people that tend to work shift work can be more susceptible to sort of stress and things like that. So you'll certainly need the risk assessment, and then beyond that, I think it's about thinking about the sort of the key staff as well, and sort of, will you need any additional staff there? Do you have a sort of a shift supervisor or a competent person that can cover each shift? Do you have enough first aiders to cover shift patterns? And what about emergency arrangements like fire? Would that be any different on different shift patterns? And it's just making sure, there's going to be a training and information element here as well before you start that. It's just making sure that everyone knows what they're doing and what the company arrangements are as well. There's certainly no reason why you shouldn't consider that, and it could be very beneficial to the business.
Sounds like communication and consultation is the key to that answer. Thank you, gentlemen. So if that hasn't happened and employees are not happy with the working arrangements, can they take action? I mean, what's the situation there?
Yeah, from the health and safety perspective, there's certainly a duty on every employer to look after their staff, and that's always been cemented in law, in the Health and Safety at Work Act, for instance. So, going back to what we've been saying a lot really on this webinar today is that consultation is very important. You're going to need to go back with run through your risk controls with staff, talk about what you've put in place. Try and understand their fears. What are their worries? Are they founded? Ultimately, you don't want this situation to blow up into something where they're starting to talk about sort of talking to the HSE or phoning the HSE or the local authority up, which is ultimately what they could do if they wanted to. And certainly there's an emphasis on the new guidance that, and in fact, the HSE have actually produced a brand new guide as a result of the new guidance that's come out, called Talking with Your Workers. And that's quite good practical advice on how you can talk these things through with your workers and hopefully head off these sort of problems.
Yeah, I've got some comments on that, and we're getting these questions in on this sort of Section 44 Employment Rights Act, which, for those that haven't read the Employment Rights Act lately, I expect everyone's becoming an expert on it. It basically gives employees the right to go home or remain away from work if they are in serious and imminent danger. Now, yes, they do have that right. That wasn't really designed for these sorts of circumstances, I have to say. And I think it's really important that we don't get to that point. At the end of the day, it's clearly going to be important to build confidence. Just standing on the law, if they decide they're going to stay at home and you as the employer decide, well, I don't think you're justified and I'm not going to pay you, you're going to at some point end up in the employment tribunal. But that's probably not going to be for quite a while, with the delays in the employment tribunal system that there are, which have been exacerbated, of course, by this. So you really want to resolve it, and they will want to resolve it as well, without this idea that they're entitled, in inverted commas, to stay at home. If you're doing your job properly as an employer and following the advice that both myself and particularly my colleague Pete have been suggesting, you're very likely to be able to show that actually you have created a safe working environment. And, employees need to get real on this. So I think we're all in the same boat. We're all coming from a sort of lockdown position to try and make the workplace safe and go back to work. Employers are very much in the front line. People do have understandable concerns. It's really a good idea to involve staff and try and head those off as early as you can. I think if you remain having sort of staff who you feel are being particularly awkward, really do take some advice before you take any action against them, because this is a very dangerous area, tied up with breach, alleging breach of health and safety, alleging whistleblowing and so on, that they could say, oh, you dealt with it in a really high-handed manner. So do take advice if talking isn't getting you anywhere.
Thanks for that. So moving into looking at illness and things like that, if we've got staff who are refusing to come in, say for example because they've got diabetes or some other underlying health condition, can they do this? Can they refuse to come into work? And can I, as an employer, ask them for proof?
Okay, yeah, so it's really interesting, and there is, again, understandably, a lot of confusion here. But basically, there's two groups of people who need to take care. One are called the clinically vulnerable, and that also includes people over 70. And they're basically just advised to be particularly careful about following the government guidance. And then there's another category, which are called extremely clinically vulnerable. And this doesn't include all people over 70. It includes people with particular conditions. And those conditions are set out in law. And they also, there's also a degree of severity in those conditions. Now, those people should have received some form of letter from some branch of the NHS telling them that they should be shielding. And if they're shielding, that you could pay them furlough pay. And I can't see how it would possibly be a problem for you to ask to see evidence if you didn't believe them. For others, if they're saying, well, I feel vulnerable because I have asthma, but I've not got the letter. Well, you can ask for evidence of that condition in much the same way you could ask for evidence if they were off sick in any other circumstances where you want to see evidence that they're not able to return to work. I think you need to be sensitive here, really do. But in principle, I don't see any reason not for asking for evidence. But as I say, the important point is not to get confused between those two categories. And I think we have had a question about the over 70s. Well, the over 70s per se can go into work. They're not extremely clinically vulnerable unless they've been told they are. In terms of advice, as I say, possibility of furlough and possibility of working from home, I suppose. Any sort of views, Pete?
So, similar views to you, Nick, on that one, really. I think the position is that both those categories workers should be working at home, ideally. As you said, it's quite an emotive term, really, even clinically vulnerable, because clearly some of those people are very fit and healthy 70-year-olds who quite possibly are quite raring to get back into work again. And if they can't do their work at home and they need to come into an office environment, then that's fine. Again, you're just going to need to think carefully about your risk controls and your risk assessment, maybe a little bit differently for them than you would be for an average employee, if you like, if that's the right terminology. So, it may be that someone who's over 70-year-old getting the fit and healthy, but perhaps they can work in their own office. They're not public facing. Maybe they don't need to come in on public transport, in which case it's the risks are reasonably low in that case. So it will depend.
Okay, thanks. But we have had a question around what if we know that we've got someone who they might be asymptomatic, they might be symptomatic, but they insist upon coming into work. As an employer, what is our position and what do we have to do?
Well, I'll have a go at answering this, and I think Pete may want to come in on it as well. Because in small communities, it may be that people actually know other people and say, well, you're just, out and about, and you're not obeying social distancing when you're out and about, and you're having parties in houses and whatever, and yet you're coming into work, and I'm supposed to treat you as if you hadn't put yourself at that risk. It's really difficult because traditionally in employment law, we don't really seek to police employees' behaviour outside the workplace. And there's no additional powers being given for employers to do that. So in employment law, from an employment law point of view, it is fairly easy to say that the employer really can't be expected, and they're not obliged to police this sort of behaviour. They can certainly have a word in someone's ear, but I don't feel that the employers should and can take on that responsibility. If someone's presenting at work without symptoms and they're behaving at work in accordance with social distancing, then really difficult to know what else the employer could reasonably be expected to do. Pete, do you have a view on that?
Really, nothing more than you said, to be honest, Nick, on that. I mean, you can take a softly approach with them and talk with that person and just try and understand a bit more around their reasoning and things. But as you say, that ultimately you can't police it. You can talk about sort of company reputation and things like that, but there's not much more you can do, in all honesty.
Okay, so let's talk now a little bit about furlough. We've had a question in about a company who furloughed some staff last week, but after the announcement on Sunday, they're now actually able to resume work in the workplace. What can they do with those staff? Because we thought it was a minimum 3-week period help.
Yeah, it is a minimum 3-week period if you want to claim the government grant. So if you did furlough some staff last week, nothing to stop you having them back at work at all, but you won't be able to claim the furlough grant for the time that they've had away on furlough. You would have to meet those salary costs yourself. If you do want to claim the grant, it's got to be a minimum 3-week period. And so that could be awkward if an employer has been maybe even rotating people and they've unfortunately, sort of just re-furloughed some people. To be honest, if it's only 1 or 2 days, it may be the employer's prepared to take that cost. If they're sort of, a couple of weeks in, then maybe better to keep them on furlough. I mean, just because we're in a situation where employers have been advised to get people back to work doesn't mean you have to do it straight away. So really, you do need to consider that. And certainly, if you haven't considered it in getting people back from furlough, do, because it's a minimum 3-week period.
Okay, and a supplementary question to that one then is, if, for example, we've been alternating furlough in teams, or you've got, a whole team furloughed and you only need to have a couple of members of staff back into work, is that okay? How would you go about splitting that out?
Yes, well, I think I said, when we were talking about it earlier, I think I said you toss a coin. I was being only slightly flippant. Some people respond better to furlough than others. But at the end of the day, and I think we have had a question on it, can I get them back at 24 hours notice? Well, yes, unless you've put something in the furlough letter saying we'll give you at least a week's notice, then yes, they should be ready, willing and able to come back to the workplace because they're still under contract with you. So, you could select people and say, look, I want you and you back, but you and you stay on furlough. I think, again, to stop rumours going around, you're the favoured one, or you're favoured because you're on furlough, or favoured because you're not on furlough, it's really important that you do actually explain to staff what you're doing. And you say, look, either ask for volunteers so that those who are most ready can go, or at least chat about why you're asking certain people and expecting others. Maybe you get a call in the next week or two, or whatever. Explain it to them, because it will lead to bad feeling, and I can't judge whether it's bad feeling because people would prefer to be at home or because they prefer to be at work. So you just can't judge how people are going to react.
Thanks, Nick. And finally, the furlough scheme, we've just heard it's been extended. So what is the position on that?
Yes, it's good news for employers. It's extended now to the end of July. in its current format, no changes at all. But from the 1st of October and running to the, 1st of August and running to the end of October, it's going to be reformed. And we understand that it will allow some part-time working while still claiming furlough, which has been one of the criticisms of the system. But the employer will be expected to contribute towards the pay costs. And at the moment, employers, can drop the pay to 80%, and they don't have to contribute if they've agreed that reduction. But what employers can't do is reduce the pay percentage further. They're still going to have to make the pay up to 80%. We don't know what the government is planning in terms of the percentage that they're doing, and we don't know how that's going to work with the returning to work part-time. Chancellor Rishi Sunak announced this earlier this week and said, look, we will have more details by the end of May. At the moment, what I've told you is literally all there is to know. But the good news is it's extended in its current form, 31st July, no change at all.
Thanks, Nick. We have had quite a few questions coming through around risk assessments, forms, checklists, and also web links. So what I would say to everybody is that by registering for today's webinar, you will shortly be sent a follow-up email, which gives a load of useful website links, including a link to the Mentor website. And if you click on the Coronavirus Read More button, you can register to use our e-system Mentor Live free of charge. We are also at the moment offering a 3-month advice service, which is chargeable. But if you want to know more about any of our services, our contact details are available on our website. Now, by logging into Mentor Live and using the dedicated coronavirus section, you will have access to our regularly updated FAQs, risk assessment templates, letters, much, much more. And you'll also find the registration links to our weekly sessions. Our one next week will be focusing on well-being. I'd like to thank Nick and Pete, our panellists, for sharing their knowledge today, and also to thank all of you for joining us. Thank you very much.
The recording has stopped.